have to hold over till Thursday with some of them, I will. But I want to talk to you about glazes. So we heard from Stacy last week, and that was really nice. You got to see a little bit inside of her studio, and she probably used some terminology that you weren't super familiar with. So I want to go over what glazes are, how we apply them, and then I want to talk to you a ton about kilns, because the way in which you fire the pots really changes the way that they look. And I thought you might be interested in hearing a little bit about different types of kilns. So the first thing that we want to talk about is what's the purpose of the glaze. In these images on the left, you can see raw glaze, and then you can see this mug after it's fired. Colors are really, really different. It's a chemical process. Everything about glazing has to do with the thermodynamics, really, of rocks ground up into powders and put onto the surface and turned into glass. So the glaze is meant to create this clean, smooth surface, so we know how rough clay can be. It provides decoration. It can also provide waterproofing, so it seals any open pores, so even anything like earthenware clay would be sealed if it had this glass over the surface of it. And it increases the clay body strength, because the basis of all glazes is, of course, silica, which is one of the hardest materials. So glazes can be colored, or they can be clear. They can be translucent or opaque, so you can see all the way through them, or like on the inside of this bowl, you're kind of seeing through to the white clay. And that dark spot in the middle is just where the glaze is pulled up. And then on the outside is an opaque glaze. You can't see through it at all. And this tea bowl that has a green glaze on it, you can see one of the benefits of the transparent glaze is you can see a little bit of that clay body coming through the cracks on the surface where this has really been roughed up, and then where it's thicker, it's a little bit darker. So glazes can be glossy or semi-glossy, so they have some sort of sheen to them. This is Sarah Yeager. I believe she lives out in Montana, and she layers her glazes, and they're all really, really glossy. And you can see this, the reflection of the light coming in from the windows. It's so glossy. Glazes can also be matte and semi-matte, so kind of with no sheen at all. And sometimes you can control the gloss or the matte based on how high you fire them. So some glazes, if you fire them at a low temperature, they're going to be kind of matte, but if you keep firing them higher and higher, they get glossy. Whereas the two tea bowls that you see here, these bright turquoise and blue, those particular colors, that rich blue color and matte, because of a material called barium. So some materials, you never really overcome their capacity to kind of keep things at a matte finish. And then some glazes are going to be really, really bright, and some are going to be what I would call dull, but the colors are much more earthen. So when you think about red in particular, it's important to note, like, that red on the left comes from one or two particular materials or a particular type of firing. So the material is called cadmium, or maybe a reduction firing, which I'll talk about in a minute. That's a really hard red to achieve. So you have to have those very special materials, and cadmium is super, super toxic. So it's not something you just like leave around the studio to paint things red with. But that red that's on the right, that earthen red, of course, we've seen that a lot with the color of the clay. So when I talk about the colors, some of them are really easy to achieve because they are naturally occurring, and some of them take a pretty decent amount of steady chemistry to make them happen. So again, here's just some of those more natural earthen colors. These are things that can be pulled right out of the earth. And then when you think about these really bright colors, and this is Eva Zeisel out of Zelsonoy factory in Russia. These are all luster to get that red, and to get these like high copper glazes. They're usually really high in metals, fired in particular ways to get those kind of sheen. So just different materials, different options. So when we think about decoration that goes on the surface, there's a couple different places that you can put decoration on. One is they can go under the glaze, which is what I've been doing with my moon pots, painting on the slip, and then like a little bit of underglaze and carving through. So this is a white clay. It has underglaze painted on the surface, and then it's scratched back through to the white clay to help her make her illustrations. All of these things that go under a glaze, they're probably pretty matte and dry as surfaces, and so a lot of times people will put glazes, or at the very least clear glaze, over the top of them. So this is an example of like an underglaze painted paint plate. So underglaze, because it has a little bit of clay in it, you paint it and it stays right where you paint it. And that's different than glaze. We'll talk about that in a second. But when you paint under these glazes on there, they're pretty particular and you can get pretty illustrative with them. Decoration can also be in the glaze itself. And so this vase with this stripes and this big blue stripe, this is just one single glaze on the surface of a pot. And depending on how thick or thin it is, then that changes the color. So the glaze itself can be decorative. So you don't need anything with it. It's just its relationship to the pot. And here's one where you can kind of see the ridges showing up from a temuku glaze, and temuku means that it's high in iron. So nothing but just one single glaze, and that difference is coming from the glaze itself. So the last thing is on top of the glaze with decals and overglazes and colorants and washes, and that's kind of what we saw Stacy do. So this is an image of a potter, Ian Anderson, that uses printed out decals. And I said on class last time that we actually have a decal printer at school. So when we get back, if anybody wants to try the decals, they can. So these bottles already had a clear glaze on top of them. And then he did this image transfer onto the surface and then fired them again. And so this is kind of like Stacy's decals that were kind of that burnt red. So the white and the yellow are glaze underneath, and then there is this iron transfer that's gone onto the surface. So it's an interesting way to kind of get really graphic details on your pot. So again, the glaze has already been fired, and this is in a follow-up process. Lusters like gold, silver, platinum, things like that can all be painted on the surface of pots, and it's very familiar to you in maybe like fine china, stripes around the outside or pretty flowers painted or something. Most of the yellow in this plate is a gold luster, and that would also be added over the glaze. So decoration can be under the glaze, in the glaze itself, or put over the glaze in another process. And when you think about what is in a glaze, there are three major components to every single glaze. Silica being the most important and the basis of all glazes, in the fact that it is the glass substance. It is the silica that is making the glass surface on the outside. Silica melts at a really high temperature. So in every glaze, there has to be a flux, which is a material that would determine the melting point. So it would encourage it to melt at a particular temperature. A stabilizer is something that's in the glaze. So once you have a glaze and it's on the surface of the pot and it's in the kiln and it turns into molten glass, it wants to run. Gravity still exists. So it wants to run off the pot. And a stabilizer actually kind of controls the viscosity of the glaze, so it doesn't run as much. And you want that stabilizer to kind of hold on to the open, hot molecules that are inside the surface of the glaze. So those are the three things that have to be there to be a glaze, but that doesn't really account for what it looks like. So every glaze could have some kind of additive, like a colorant, a surface finish, can make it opaque, can make it crystalline, which means literally little tiny crystals grow on the surface of the pot as it's cooling. So all of those things are added in on top of these three major components, and that's what changes it. And when you think about, when it's getting fired, I talk about temperature because it's really important that the clay and the glazes and the kiln are aligned to fire to the right temperature. And the way that we talk about temperature is through cones. So even though we're going to talk about kilns more in just a minute, looking into this picture, perhaps you see these little spikes of clay, and you see two sets, one pointing to the left in the back and one pointing to the right in the front. Those are called cones. Each one of those sticks of clay represents a different temperature and perhaps rate of increase of temperature in a kiln. And so I make these little cone packs that have all these little cones in them. And as they melt, I know the kiln is getting to a particular temperature. And so these are sequential. So once one falls in, I would expect the next and the next. And then I always put in a couple extra above the temperature that I want to go, just in case I overfire. And then I know I better shut the kiln off right away. So when you think about cones, it is a number system, and they go from 020 to 20. And when I say O in front of them, like 020 being the lowest number, it's kind of like a negative number, saying like -20. So the next higher temperature is 019, 018. It goes all the way up to 02 and 01. It skips 0 and then jumps over to 1 and goes all the way up to 20. Now, the typical firing range is we bisque fire to 08. So we fire our pots one time to make them a little bit stronger. And then we fire them to cone 5, sometimes 6 if I use the big manual kiln. So that's a few cones higher. And the difference is the first firing is maybe 1800 degrees, and then our second firing is more like 2100 degrees Fahrenheit. So cones is a way to mark the temperature. It's a vocabulary word. It's pretty important. When we are ready to glaze our pots, I want to talk about a few different ways that you can apply glazes. The first thing that you do is clean your pots. So the kiln room is super dusty. Maybe you've carved on the surface, whatever, sanded. The pots are really dusty and you want to wash them off. And it's also important that you do not have a bunch of oils on your hands, like lotion or any other kind of residue, skin oils, things like that, because that can get into the pores of the clay and then it'll keep the glaze from sticking. After you clean it, what you can see here is this person is dipping, and that's what we do. We dip our pots into big buckets of glaze because I think it's the easiest way to get an even layer. But you can see there's no glaze sticking on the bottom, and some of you asked in our last class about wax. So we use liquid wax in the studio to paint on the bottom of the pots, and sometimes as a decorative tool. And the wax seals up the pores on the clay so that no glaze can get inside of it. It's very important that there's no glaze on the bottom of the pots, because when they go into the kiln and the glaze gets hot, it turns into molten glass. When it cools, of course, it solidifies. So if there's glaze on the bottom and it's on the shelf, then the shelf and the pot fuse together with that glass, and you have to break it to get it off. So it's catastrophic failure. You have to clean off the bottom, and wax is a way to not waste glaze because it's kind of expensive and it's messy. It can get into little tiny cracks. So we wax our pots after we wash them, and then we mix up the glazes really well with sticks to make sure that they don't settle out. And then there's some tongs, and we have those in the studio, and then you grab onto your pot and you dip them in. You hold them in for like 3 or 4 seconds to get a nice even coat over the surface. That is my favorite way to glaze. Now, there are many other options. You can pour glaze. So we saw Stacy pour glaze into the inside of her cup, which is a really good way to get the inside one color. If you want the outside a different color, just pour it in and then pour it back out. Here, this person, probably their bowl is too big to fit down inside of that bucket. If you don't have another container to just transfer it in temporarily for large pots, then maybe I pour the glaze on top of it. And some people might pour to get a particular dripping effect. So it works, but there's a chance that you're going to see some of those drips. So you just have to want that, or you have to be prepared for it. Brushing is another way to get glazes on. So you can brush over the whole surface of a pot, although I personally find that very challenging to get an even coat. And there are many glazes that show a change in thickness. So it is important that you get an even coat, thick coat. And so you can brush it all over the outside, but you just need to be generous, and it takes practice. Some people will use brushing to paint particular brush strokes. And how I say you can paint under glaze, and it'll be really specific to where it is. When you paint glaze, it's soft. The brush mark is soft and it fades. The edges are kind of soft and may even run or blur a little bit. So it's a different kind of effect. The most common reason I would brush is if I make a glaze mistake and I need to patch a hole. So I'll load up my brush and I'll patch a little spot if it's missing glaze. That's the most common reason I brush glazes. Spraying is an option if you want an even coat or if you want to do layers. We do have a spray gun in the studio, which can be hooked up to an air compressor, even through the shop out on the back porch or something. But, you know, we don't have a very good spray booth at school. You can see this person is outside because they don't want to spray in their studio, get those, you know, aerosol droplets all over everything. And you can see that they're gloved, they have a respirator on, and they have a face mask. You do not want to breathe in aerosol. I mean, I guess it's not really aerosol, but sprayed glazes. That means the glazes are really teeny tiny particles, and we're all about particles in our lungs these days. So you know if they're tiny and they're floating in the air, they're more likely to settle in your body. And, you know, this is rocks, and they have metals in them if you're using any sort of colorants. So you don't really want that inside of you. It's really important to use protective gear. I think this, I don't know if that will, that video will play for you, but this is like these bowls are coming through a conveyor belt, and they're spinning on those little trays, and they're getting sprayed from all different sizes. So this is inside of a factory. This is what spraying glazes would look like. And you can't see it, but the person right next to this is wearing absolutely no protective gear at all, and it's totally insane. That factory was from Fiestaware, and maybe we'll go there on Thursday for a few minutes. But they have, you know, really every conceivable color that you could think of can be sprayed on those pots. Here's just sort of a smaller spray setup. And you can see all the glaze that's kind of collecting in the background. This is from Emerson Pottery. We might also visit here on Thursday a little bit, but this is, again, there's like these little holders and the pots are spinning, and then they're spraying the glazes on there. And usually every so many pots, every hundreds of pots or whatever, they'll break one and then test the thickness of the glaze to make sure that the glaze is going on the same thickness as they're being run through all of these processes. Okay, beyond spraying, let's talk about sponging. I didn't put one in that was like the blue and white crockeryware, but you can sponge glazes on. This particular pot is Hunt Prothrow up in Maryland, and I worked for him for a while. He has 10 different layers of glazes on this pot, and one of them is that orange underglaze that's sponged on into different areas. So you can build up color, so it doesn't have to be as dense. Splattering, so using brushes or scraping along bristles, you could get a lot of different effects layering glazes with splattering. And then, of course, you've already seen printing. So pushing glaze or underglaze through a screen onto raw clay or onto paper and transferring it to the surface of a pot. So there are a lot of different ways to apply glazes. I'm just going to pause there. I want to show a few examples of things getting fired and what glazes, some examples of some beautiful pots before we talk about kilns. But I just want to see if there's any questions about the technical chemistry or the application of glazes before I go on. Are we okay? You can drop them in the chat if you want to. I just want to show a few pots that I think are just beautiful because of their glaze. So you can tell that this one has 2 glazes on it. Starts with that, this is Susan Silly. I think she's in South Carolina. Starts with that turquoise glaze, and then she puts just a little bit of white glaze on the top, and then you can see that it's sort of blending down into the vessel. I thought this one was kind of fun with its illustrative style. So this was probably in a salt kiln or wood fire kiln. I'll explain more in a second, but you can see a little bit of imagery there, like in that green. And and then sort of detailed drawing. So you can actually get chalk, pencils, and pens to have a different line type than painting. I thought these were kind of fun. You know, when you think about how you're going to glaze them, thinking about what is the relationship to the form is really important. And so I'm interested how this blue glaze and the brown kind of highlight the profile of these pots. When you think about pots and their sort of their clarity of form, a lot of times if the form is really, really complicated, it can be hard to have really intense glazing on there because they almost compete. So that's a lot of times when we talk about slip casting, I encourage students to, you know, it might have a shape to it, of course, but if it has a little bit of a clean palette, then you can really test some things out. So I love the way that these jars have sort of these striations of glaze on them. Again, this is a single glaze, probably depending on how thick it is or where it is in the kiln, with the exception of maybe right at the rim. That could be the addition of a secondary glaze. Any variation you're getting in there is how thick it is and where it is in the kiln. So this pot by Ruggles and Rankin, which is a husband and wife team, feels a little bit like the work that I'm trying to do now with that. You can see that it's like the color of the clay, and then they're putting on the white slip, and then they're painting over it. So they're getting these different layers. So the question about surface decoration still has some basic compositional questions. So foreground and background. Now this one is nice because it has like a black slip on the jar, and then using the wax, instead of painting the bottom of the pot to keep it clean, the wax is painted on the side of the pot after the black is on, and then the whole thing is dipped in white glaze. And so the white glaze can't stick where the wax is. So you can see how important brushwork would be there. So single stroke lines to get the vines, single strokes to get the leaf shape. You can literally see the shape of the brush and how it's flicked to get that little tiny point at the end. So wax resist can be helpful, not just for keeping things clean on your kiln shelf, but also decorating the surface. And just another little moon vase. I had to pick this slide out a long time ago, so it's fun that I'm making these pots now. Remember, this is white porcelain with copper, which is what makes the red, and cobalt, which makes the blue, and then it has a clear glaze over the top. And the copper is only red because it's fired to high temperature, and the kiln itself lacks oxygen. And we'll talk about reduction kilns in just a minute. This is super fun. You can kind of tell that this is also carved through, right? Can you see on the orange and on the turquoise that that was probably painted on and striped, and then it was carved through back down to the white clay, and then the black and the green would have been added at a different time. It may even be glazes as opposed to an underglaze. This platter is Rick Hensley out here in Floyd. So coming up this weekend actually is the 16 Hands Pottery Tour, and it's all online. So it's a really great time to see a lot of good work. 16 Hands is a group of potters here in Floyd that have 2 studio sales a year. And Rick throws with porcelain, and he does really interesting kind of texture and layering glazes, and you can see some of the glazes and the coloring that he's using. It's running, so those things are kind of unpredictable. This is Donna Paulsino, Rick's wife. She fires our same temperature, so that's really similar to our clay, that like red clay. She fires to cone 6. She uses these really matte glazes, and when you look at that vase on the right with the flowers, I'm pretty sure that she puts the darkest orange on first, and then uses a little bit of wax, and then she puts on that lighter orange and uses more wax, and then puts the black on top of it. So she has spent a lot of time learning how to layer her glazes to make imagery. So this is Sylvie Granatelli. So on the left is a lovely platter that would have been painted when it's green, kind of like I'm doing now. And then it would have that has a clear glaze on it. And you can see a little bit of the turquoise glaze that's on the outside kind of rolling into the inside of that pot. And then on the right, she does this different work that's much more textured, and that yellow glaze, that's a single glaze. The variation is coming from whatever's happening inside of the kiln. This is Ellen Schenken, and these are ash glazes. So each one of these potters has different types of glazes. That's why I think it's interesting to talk about. So the picture by Ellen Schenken has probably 4 different glazes on it, starting with that base layer brown, and then a yellow, a green, and a red. And they are runny and drippy because they have wood ash in them. And wood ash is a flux. If you remember, a flux is a term for a material that makes glazes melt. And so you get an unpredictable runniness from these ash glazes. So she has a stable red iron glaze on the bottom, and then she's putting her ash glazes on the top half of the pot, and then they start to run down through. And you can see on the right how those ash glazes will get caught in texture, and really in a single glaze have quite a huge variation. And this is probably the last of the 16 hands that I'll talk about. This is Sarah McCarthy, and most of that brown is the color of her clay, and then she's doing carving and sort of filling in the spaces like cloisonne with these really bright colors. So her pots are super playful and illustrative. Just the last couple before we talk about kilns. This is Lucy Ree. She's a potter from the 20th century, mid-20th century, modern, but she's a studio potter. She's not a production, not like a factory designer. And this glaze, that top layer is like super high in copper. She had really subtle glaze. You can even see maybe the little bubbles on the surface of the pot. So she was highlighting the rim and using a little bit of texture. I just think it's really beautiful and elegant. So I can't help but show her pots. Her partner, Hans Koper, was really heavily influenced by African art. Perhaps you can see that in the forms of these sculptures. Most of these are clay bodies with manganese dioxide rubbed into the surface. So wherever you see the black, that is manganese dioxide. So his pots are gorgeous, and I'm fascinated. And he lived a long and happy life. But I should let you know that he probably died from manganese poisoning. So some of these materials are pretty intense. The metals especially, like we need iron in our body or whatever, but we don't need like spoonfuls of it. And so manganese is pretty toxic. It probably filtered in through skin after years and years of brushing it on and then wiping it off with a sponge. So it's really important that you know what your glaze materials are. It's one of the reasons that I buy the glazes for the studio, because I'm pretty careful about what materials are in them and whether or not you can touch them as raw materials. So some glazes are fine whenever you can put your hands in them, you put them on the surface, you fire them, and they're food safe. Some things can be food safe when they're fired, but as a raw material, they can be kind of toxic. And then something like this manganese was toxic when he was using it. And this is not something that you would eat out of. Raw metals on the surface of the pot can leach into your food, and you would never eat out of that. Not that these look like drinking vessels. I'm just saying chemistry is real. Don't eat glazes. This is a pot by Ayumi Maori. I think she's in Massachusetts. I'm having trouble remembering her last name. This is kind of similar to what I'm doing in that she has red clay. She has white slip over the top. She has carved through it to make, to do drawings. She also puts decals on her pots, and then you can see those color dots are like little bits of glaze that she's kind of dotted inside of that grid. They're very playful, I think. So glaze chemistry can be kind of hard, but thinking about sort of the outcome and the color theory part of it is exciting. And to me, it's like a lifelong pursuit. These are, it's just kind of nice to think about, gosh, what chemistry would I have to deal with to get a gradient for color? These are really big questions. There's a lot of things that can influence a glaze. the clay body itself, and I'll show you an image in just a second to remind you of that. How much you fill the kiln, because temperature is really important. You can be 10 degrees off. Out of 2,000 degrees, we have glazes that if you're 10 degrees off, they do not look right. And that seems crazy, that margin of error seems crazy. But if the kiln is evenly full, then the temperature flows easily, is more likely to be even. If you have the bottom of the kiln is packed really tight and the top of the kiln is really loose, then all of the heat wants to go up, and because there's nothing there, it flows up there really easily, and then the bottom of the kiln could be cool. And if I just said 10 degrees makes a difference, then you know filling the kiln and having the kiln filled the same way each time would lead to consistency. Speed of firing and cooling, so how quickly you get hot and how quickly you cool can change if crystals grow, if the glaze melts fully, if it's matte, if it's glossy. So speed of firing should be consistent if you want consistent results. Placement in the kiln or placement near other pots. When we talk about wood firing in just a minute, you know, how close you are to the heating element, or if you're near a pot where there's a glaze that fumes, like copper fumes, or do you remember that Stacy said that black glaze fumed onto her kiln shelf and turned it blue, and then she started using the kiln wash on her pot. So there's cobalt that's literally being released as like little tiny molecules inside of the kiln. And then if there's another glaze that's hot and excited, then it'll grab it and it can change its color. Weather is important for outdoor kilns. And I'm going to say kiln gods, because I'm going to show you a lot about kilns. You're going to realize, like, holy cow, how do you ever control all these variables? And you don't. You do your best and you think good thoughts, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So that's kind of like life. So different kinds of clay is super important. When you fire, even the same clay fired at different temperatures can be radically different colors. And if you're talking about a glaze that you can see through, if you see through to another color, then you're going to get a third color, right? So the type of clay that it's on can be really important. And that is most noticeable in our class in particular, because half of our class are using red clay. And then when you slip class, you use white clay. And about 50% of our glazes look radically different on the two clay bodies. Okay, I am about to switch over into kiln land. So I just want to pause for a second and see if there are any questions before I go on. I don't see anything popping up in the chat, but you can let me know if it does, okay? Let's talk about kilns. So I want to tell you about different types of kilns and show you some examples of the work that comes out of them. And then I want to talk to you a little bit, assuming there's still time, I won't keep you over, but I would love to talk to you a little bit about kiln building, because I personally find it very interesting. So electric kilns are what we use at school. They're like glorified ovens. They have heating elements inside of them. Ours are two of ours are computer controlled. So there's a computer telling it, oh, I noticed this temperature, and now we need to go up this fast. And so it will heat up for us. And then we have one that's manual. So I tell it when each section of the kiln heats up at a different rate. And so I turn those dials up or down. The electric kiln is the only kiln that I'll talk about that is fully oxygen rich, where it's like the air that we breathe. And because it's just a hot space and not a fire, it has the same amount of oxygen. And that's important to the glazes, because as the glazes are molten and they're changing their molecular structure, if there's oxygen in the environment, then the glaze is oxygen rich. So that can lead to particular colors. So it's like a glorified toaster oven, but it can get pretty hot, still 2,200 degrees, something like that. A gas kiln is another type of kiln. So we've immediately jumped from no combustion to combustion. And this is the type of kiln another type of kiln that I have here, and I have some pictures of it. But a gas kiln is using like propane or methane or natural gas. And so there's actually like a fire inside of the kiln. The bottom left, you can see a kiln that's on tracks. So you load the pots outside of the kiln and push them in. Whereas that box kiln with that front door, you would have to load the shelves in from the side and then close the door. And this is a car kiln from Emerson Creek Pottery. So you can see they fit hundreds of pots on these big carts, and 2 or 3 of those carts fit inside of this kiln at one time. So they're firing thousands of pots at a time. And this is all like computer controlled. So there's sensors all over that kiln helping them run it. Those car kilns can get enormous. So they can get as big as tunnels. So as long as Burchard Hall is, starting on one side and pushing all the way through. So in this tunnel kiln, you can see kind of on the right, there's this little tiny sliver of super, super hot. That's because that's so deep in the kiln. That's the 1-point perspective that you're looking at the width of the kiln. But with open ends, that thing runs 24/7. It's room temperature on the ends, and on the inside, it's probably 2,400 degrees, because those are like scientific refractory tiles. So again, just another little car kiln built on a track. I went to a brick factory in Norway, and I won't play the video for you. There's not time, but one of my favorite things was walking on top of the kiln and using a big giant pole and pushing down into the kiln and fishing out a red hot brick from the center of the kiln itself. It was quite spectacular. You can see it there cooling off. So gas kilns. Those electric kilns or gas kilns are 2 really, really common kilns. But if you think about how people really started firing, it was with wood. And first, probably some kind of open air firing. So I have a few images where people would be using raw clay. They'd be burnishing the surface. So that's what this girl is doing down in the bottom left-hand corner. She's using a smooth stone and rubbing the surface of the pot quite aggressively to seal it, and then building a bonfire around it. And so they can be huge, fire lots of pots at one time. These folks are actually putting like probably dung over the top of the pots because it burns super, super hot. And sometimes people will also use like broken pots, old pots, to be an insulator. So you put your good pots in, and then you build your fire, and you put your old pots around it, and then that holds the heat in, and then the pots get even hotter. But you're really looking for that, the fire itself to come up to maybe like 1,200 to 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. That's what I've seen read on a pyrometer when you stick it into one of these open air firings. So that's enough to go through coarse inversion. So the material is permanently altered at like 1,100 degrees, but they're probably not so hot that they've been waterproofed in any way. So open air firing. From open air, you start to get more heat when you start digging down into the earth. So like pit firing or sawdust firing is a really common way, and it comes up with some really interesting effects. So depending on what kind of materials you put inside of the pit, the colors can be really dramatically different. On this pot where it's black, that means it did not have a lot of oxygen. So it was like a lot of carbon settled on the surface there. And then that red, those things come from other materials you put inside with the pots. And so here you can see somebody like wrapping up one of their pots inside of newspaper, and they put all sorts of stuff in there. You can put, I use steel wool because I like the way the metal fumes, copper, salt, iron, even like the weirdest things that you can think of, like banana peels that are high in potassium, which is a really common glaze material. Some people use dog food because there's a disturbingly high amount of metals and other types of minerals inside of dog food. Those things fume like wacky colors. And then you put them inside of the pit, and then you build the fire around them, and you keep adding wood until the pots are completely covered in red hot coals. And then here you can see these folks are using like old metal roofing pieces to kind of keep the heat in. And I usually bury mine again, cover them back up in dirt and leave them for a day or two to cool. Oh, sorry, that was a repeat slide. Must have copy and pasted excitedly. So here's just a couple images of pots that are coming out of raku kilns, out of pit kilns. So if they're super, super black, that means they were deep, deep, deep inside of the fire and did not get a lot of oxygen. And so that's why there can be a little bit of variation across them. You never really know how close they are going to be to the air. This one is from Africa. It's decorated very beautifully with some metal work. Beautiful metal stands. This is probably poured wine or some other fermented beverage. After open air and pit, you can kind of see here, this is half buried and then some broken pots over the top. So this is kind of looking in this section of what sort of burying pots might have looked like. And so as we want to get hotter, we start to transition into kilns. And here you can see, that they've started to build up with bricks. Again, another place to kind of corral the heat to kind of reflect it back into the pots, get them as hot as possible. This transitions into something called like a groundhog kiln. So now we have some refractory materials that are being built in the ground as well. And then especially for a chimney's sake, kind of pulling them up out of the ground. So using the ground itself as a thermal insulator, but then adding to that shape. So most of these kilns that we're talking about are all fired with wood. So wood is special. In the images that you see here, the pots have this rich earthen brown, and then there's a lot of variation in the surface, and it can be even more so than you see here. Because what's happening is as the wood is burning, all the minerals from the wood are floating around as ash inside of the kiln. And when the pots are super hot and the molecules are open in the surface, then they grab those minerals from the floating ash, and it collects on the surface, and it turns into a glaze. So it seals the surface of the pots. And we looked at some of these kilns the other day. These are the dragon kilns. We looked at this one in particular from Jingdezhen. Told you it took 2 chimneys, probably take 5 days to fire that kiln. This is a small wood kiln at a school down in North Carolina called the John C. Campbell Folk School. And this is an onigami kiln, so it's a Japanese style kiln. It has 2 compartments in it. And here on the right, you can see us working as a team to load this kiln up. And I don't know if I can get that little video to play for you, but on the left, you can kind of see it's awfully dark, but that is that 2-chamber kiln, and everywhere where you see light is flames shooting out of that kiln. So this is an experience where there are 4 different ports, and we're adding wood every 2 or 3 minutes for about 10 hours straight. Before that, it's probably every like 10 to 15 minutes that we're adding wood. And by the time that the whole kiln is at temperature, the flame is so long and so hot that it's shooting up the top and out of the kiln. And on the right, you can kind of see that's a wood-fired pot. And those 3 dots are actually where that pot was on its side, and it was resting on seashells to kind of block the flame and give it a little bit of decoration. And so that's all of that ash deposited on the surface. And you kind of have to build your pots up. You can't let them sit right on the shelves, or else the ash will actually glaze them to the shelves, just like if you never had wax on the bottom. So this is us opening up that 2-chambered onigami kiln, looking inside. So you can see anything that looks sort of brown to red. If it's not blue or yellow or green, it is probably just colored from the ash in the glaze. And so these are the pots that I made from that kiln, and some of these are in my office if you want to see them closer. But you have to really like earthy colors to want to wood fire. But it's pretty spectacular. You never know exactly what you're going to get. So one of the kilns that we talked about with Stacy was the salt kiln. So a salt kiln or soda kiln can be gas or wood fired, but the idea is that when it's at its hottest temperature, you actually add salt or soda, either as a powder or as a liquid, spraying it in. So for salt here, you can see this woman has an angle iron at least that's what that is, I promise you, is a giant piece of angle iron, and it's probably filled with 5 pounds of salt, granulated salt inside of it. And so she opens up that port and she pushes it in, and you can see it's right over the firebox. So she pours that salt into the flames and it immediately vaporizes, and the sodium attaches to the surface of the pots and gives this orange peel texture. So wherever you see this, like those don't have any glaze on them, none of those pots have glaze on them. That's just that surface, that material collecting on the surface. And then the chlorine from the salt connects with the hydrogen in the atmosphere and goes up the chimney as hydrochloric acid, which is why Stacy said you can't do it in like an urban area. Because it literally makes, it's like literally raining hydrochloric acid. Like you put the salt in, you run away, or you wear a respirator. So that's why people started using soda. It's less toxic because it doesn't have chlorine. But it's pretty corrosive. So again, here, the whole orange peel texture, that's no glaze, that's all of the salt or sodium like sitting on the surface. So when it goes into the kiln, once you make a salt kiln, it is a salt kiln because that fumes is on everything. And here you can actually see the salt has collected on the surface of like a shelf and is dripping off. There's so much of it. And here on this little tiny teapot, you can actually see inside the kiln, it looks kind of glossy, and that's all that salt. You can see the salt collecting on the side of the shelf. That's what that white stuff is. And then you can see that the teapot is actually on these little tiny white balls, and those keep it from sticking to the shelf because you can knock those things off. They're high in alumina, so they don't absorb the salt as well. Okay, last major kiln type I want to talk about is a raku kiln. Raku kilns are usually kind of small, and they are fast fire. This is a modern one, but they're traditionally fired with wood. It's a Japanese style. But the idea is that you get the pots really hot, really fast. And when they are red hot and the glazes are completely molten, you open up the kiln and you pull them out and you put them in a garbage can full of combustible material. So here you can see this guy opening it up from the top, and we're getting ready to pull those pots out. So when you build it, yeah, you have to figure out how you're going to open this thing up. Here, it's actually on a pulley system. So we were able to kind of pulley chain that structure up. And then you can see she has tongs, and she's pulling the pots out. Here you can see this lady, her kiln is behind her. She has some tongs. She's grabbing the pots, she's putting them in a garbage can, and that's full of like leaves or paper or straw or something, and they catch on fire, and then you cover the pots. And so the reason you do this is called reduction. So like the gas kiln or the wood kiln, this raku kiln, wherever there are flames, glazes change because of them. To have a fire, you need oxygen. So whenever the fire is burning, it's eating the oxygen in the atmosphere. And like here in the garbage can, you let it flame up so that everything in the garbage can is going to burn, but you put a lid over the top of it, and that smothers it. And when you smother it, then the fire burns all of the oxygen out of the atmosphere in that tiny trap space. And when it's still hungry and it still wants to burn, it starts to pull the oxygen out of the glazes itself, literally pulling oxygen molecules out of the glazes. And when you do that, you change the chemistry and then you change the color. So that is called reduction. It is a reduction of oxygen in an environment, and that changes the glazes. And it's variable. It's hard to control. But here for these, like it's giving these really wild spot colors. Right, and raku is really high in metals, so it's not food safe, and it's also low temperature, so it's very porous. But here, there's a gold medallion in the center, which is a gold-based glaze, and then that outside is a copper-based glaze. And even though some of it is very copper and some of it is very green or very red, it's all one glaze. And depending on where it is in the fire, changes where those fumes change the color. So although you might know it's going to be a rainbow, you have no idea where the rainbow colors are going to show up. So we got to build one of these kilns at school. It was super fun. It doesn't take too many parts, but we put it together with a wire frame and with fiber. We made some ceramic buttons to kind of hold it all in place. And then we fired it up at school. It was pretty great. And I still have that kiln. If there's ever time and we all make pots again, it's something that I fire up in the backyard if anybody ever wants to pit fire. But these are just some of the pots that we got out of that. I am about to talk a little bit about kiln building. Are there any questions about different types of kilns before I talk to you a little bit about how they go together or any experimental kilns? Okay, you can let me know at the end. I don't see anything popping up in the chat just yet. But I just wanted to show you a few kilns that I've worked on because I think they're interesting. This is an energy exchange kiln. It's in North Carolina. The reason I like this kiln is because it's actually fired with methane from a landfill. So this landfill was full, and now they're harvesting the methane for a glass studio, a greenhouse, and a pottery studio. And so the pottery studio used the methane to fire. And this is the first kiln building class I ever took. So I wanted to learn how to make one of these kilns so I could come home and make my own. And so this is just, I'm going to flip through these kind of quickly, but these are just how it starts, like how it all goes together. Layering cinder block and wonder board. There's two different kinds of bricks. There's soft bricks and hard bricks. The soft bricks are the lighter color, and they're great at, they're much more lightweight. You can cut them really easily. But the floor and the lower walls of the kilns are always hard bricks because the soft bricks can break and crack really easily. So the hard bricks are much more durable for where you're going to be like loading your pots in and out. So you basically, all of this kiln is a dry stack. So there's no mortar. It's loose construction. The orientation of the bricks locks the walls together. As you build up, you build in things like peepholes or burner ports. All of those things are built up layer by layer. You can see as we're all wearing eye protection because of all of the dust from the bricks is really aggressive. It really hurts your eyes when you get in it. And also maybe some face masks for cutting the bricks because of the silica. This is like kind of looking right back into the back of the chimney. So it needs like a damper. So this is us trying to figure out, we're going to use a kiln shelf eventually to slide in and out, and that opens and closes the chimney and changes how it draws. The kiln is called a sprung arch downdraft kiln. So it has these vertical walls that come up and a set of iron bars that sort of cinch it together, and that's what holds the arch in place. To build the arch, you have to build a form. So this is us building an arch form. It helps us determine the angles at which we cut any sort of side bricks. And then it also determines, there are special arch bricks that have a shape to them that help lock the arch in shape. So this is us setting up a jig to cut all of the side bricks that will then hold the arch in shape. So those side bricks will go all the way down the kiln, and then we'll layer the arch bricks on top. So we're putting up the angle irons, which have to go up first to hold the walls in place. Putting on a layer of hard brick so that it's nice and robust right before we put the bricks on top. And then using that angle iron and the bricks that we have cut, that's set in place. And we are going to support the arch inside with some 2x4s to kind of hold it in place and align it at the right spot. It is possible. I've seen people build these in such a way that they get themselves stuck and they can't get it back out of the door, and then they have to burn them out. But that's not I don't recommend that. This is built so that you could take out those wooden legs and we can remove the arch once the bricks are in place. So here we are lining those bricks up on top and tapping them down into place. And when the arch was totally in, we were able to lift out that wooden piece, and then the arch stays in place because of the way that the angle iron is cinched around the kiln. We put on a layer of fiber and then a second layer of bricks. So the kiln in any one place is, 8 or 9 inches thick to reflect the heat back in. And there you can see that there was a separate wooden form made just for the door arch. So pulling the arch into the wall, making it a little bit smaller. And looking inside of the kiln, there's something called a bag wall. As the flames come into the kiln, they hit that bag wall, which is made of hard brick. Some of the heat filters through, as you can see through the holes, but most of the heat goes up to the top of the chimney. And it's called a sprung arch downdraft kiln because the heat rises up to the sprung arch and then down back to the chimney and out the back of the kiln. So there's full circulation from bottom to top and back to bottom again to try and get the kiln to be even. And I think the most interesting thing about this was, of course, that it was using the methane. So this had a special burner system. My burners are not this complicated. This has a blower because there was no, like the way my propane tank works, assuming there's enough gas in it, there's just enough natural pressure that the flame draws the gas out. But here, because they were working off of this methane system, they had to have a pump and a blower that regulated how much of the methane was coming to the kiln at any one time. And it was interesting because you couldn't really see the flame, especially during the daytime. The flame was almost invisible. It was unusual. So after building this kiln, Meg, my friend of mine who was in those pictures, we came back and we built our own kiln. And I'll just show you a couple pictures here and then I'll stop because I know we're almost at the end of class. But we built this kiln and we call it Shimmy because he has lots of little tiny bricks to make him just the right size. Is the kiln shed in the backyard. If you guys ever come visit the house, you'll see it. This is kind of what it looks like loaded up. And there are 2 stacks. So that's the front stack. And then there's a whole nother set of shelves that's like that, that's in the back. So it's over 30 cubic feet. So it takes me 4 bisque loads, like, our electric kilns at school. I have to fill one of those 4 times to have enough pots to fill this. So when I was working full time, it would take me about a month to make enough decent pots. I mean, I could make pots faster, but they would all be bowls or something. To make enough decent pots to fill the kiln. And when it's on, it's pretty exciting. There's 4 burners. You would never need it, but it gets up to something like 700,000 BTUs per hour. But there on the right, you can see it when it's at full strength. And you can actually, I lined up so you could kind of see the heat through the different cracks in the dry stack door. So I put those door bricks in one at a time every time I fire and then take them back out. So they're a little bit loose.